The second part of our discussion of chapter 48 is about the parts of the nervous system, if you will. And you see a word in here called, the word is cephalization. That means having a head, okay, having something in charge, a head end or something in charge, okay? And the key in vertebrate nervous systems is that they're regionally specialized. In other words, you have a head end, if you will, unlike the starfish or the hydra, which is just a nerve net. Here's a human illustration of a human nervous system. We have the brain and spinal cord, which make up what's called the central nervous system. Okay, and then you have what are called the peripheral nervous system, which are all the nerves that radiate off that. We have cranial nerves, which feed the face, and then we have spinal nerves, which branch off at every vertebrae has a spinal nerve associated with it. And you can map regions of the body based on this. So if you touch here, that message is going up that nerve. If you destroy this nerve, you lose feeling and motor function in this area, and so on. So if somebody breaks their neck between the common place to be a quadriplegic is to break between C3 or C4 and C5 right here. Okay, notice that if you break the spine right here, feeling exists up in here. Everything, any message coming up from here down is lost and going out. So, as I said, the PNS transmits information to and from the CNS, being central nervous system. And then the stuff about cranial and spinal nerves is right here, as I just said. And then down here, the peripheral nervous system has two functional components that you should know: somatic and autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, let's take a little time to talk about right now. Okay, and here's a chart that shows you the idea. We have the peripheral nervous system consisting of the somatic. That's all the stuff that you control, that you think about, muscle control and stuff like that. Autonomic, you kind of see the word automatic in here. Has two divisions: sympathetic, parasympathetic. Have three divisions, sorry, which have opposing effects. They work on all the same organs. And then the enteric, which works on the digestive tract. We'll skip over that a little bit. Okay? So again, involuntary, automatic nervous system. And so let's talk about let's look at the parasympathetic and the sympathetic with this diagram here. Okay? The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is also called the fight or flight division. It's here that you are either going to, where your body gets ready for either fight or flight. Sorry, let me move this. So you see all the things that happen. You dilate the pupil of the eye. You relax the bronchi in the lungs, which increases air. Accelerate the heart. That makes sense if you're getting ready to run. Inhibit the activity of the stomach and intestines. Stimulate glucose release from the liver, which would mean that glucose would break glycogen, or the liver would break glycogen down. Okay, stimulates the adrenal gland for adrenaline. Okay, so all of this is in the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic is the return to normal, or sometimes called rest and digest. Okay, has the opposite effects throughout the body. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at pretty much the parts of the brain. And now when we talk about the brain, there's a lot of stuff we really don't understand. So we're just going to talk in this lecture about what we do know and kind of just gloss over it. And then in class we can talk in more detail about some of the things we've learned. So we have the brain stem. And back here a second. Okay, the brain stem is down here. Okay, the spinal cord is defined as beginning where the skull ends. Then you have the brain stem. Okay, the medulla oblongata, the pons. Let me go back. Okay, the medulla oblongata has control centers that are in charge of several visceral functions. That would be things that the sympathetic, or I'm sorry, things like digestion, heart rate, breathing, and I know I'm writing kind of fast, but you can hear me. Pons also participates in that. The midbrain contains centers for receipt and integration of sensory information, and we'll come back to that idea. Okay, in the core of the brainstem is a part of the brainstem is called the reticular formation. And in there, we know that there are some nerves that regulate sleep and wake. So as messages come in from the brain, if you're asleep, they aren't sent on, or come in from the body. If you're asleep, there's a group of nerve cells in here that when they're on, continue to send the message on. When they're off, quote, off, the message is stopped. It's called the reticular formation. It's in charge of sleep and wake. Cerebellum. Let me click ahead and show you where that is. Back here in the brain. Okay, the cerebellum is in charge of learning and remembering motor skills. So what I call learned reflexes. Anything you have learned that you don't have to think about anymore. Like what? Well, walking, talking, chewing, or not chewing, walking, talking, riding a bike, throwing and playing catch. All that stuff is learned in your cerebellum. Click ahead again to show you where we're talking. Now we're going to talk about the diencephalon. Diencephalon consists of a couple of parts, the thalamus, the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. Epi means upon, like epidermis. The thalamus is the main input center for sensory information, and it's kind of the filter. I'm going to abbreviate this and say the filter for sensory information. So you decide, this is where your brain kind of, if you're daydreaming, your thalamus is shutting off sensory information from the outside. Okay? The hypothalamus, and I'll show you where it is again. The hypothalamus, we've talked about before with hormones, okay, regulates homeostasis, so regulates the, and is in basic survival behaviors. So kind of like emotions, okay, kind of. Things like feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproducing, and feeling those feelings you get with that. Hypothalamus, it's a connection between the brain and the endocrine system. So if we look at this slide here, the thalamus is located right here in the middle. Here's the hypothalamus. It's associated with the pituitary gland, remember? I'll write this neater. Pituitary, which is the main gland in charge of hormones. As nerve messages come into the thalamus, they are routed to where they have to go. The hypothalamus also regulates what are called circadian rhythms. We looked at circadian rhythms in plants, how some plants know when it's nighttime, they droop their leaves. Okay, humans, animals have a biological clock. There are, they give this big word, suprachiasmatic nuclei in the hypothalamus that regulate your body. For example, in a ground squirrel here, they expose them to light and dark, 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark, and here's when they were asleep in the shaded, and here's when they were awake, and you see it's, and the rest is when they're awake, and you see it's pretty uniform, that they pretty much slept at night and were awake during the day. But when they took the same squirrel and put them in constant darkness, it took them, after about 3 weeks, look at their sleep-wake patterns. okay, because they have no idea, quote, when light and when dark is. Okay, it has totally destroyed their circadian rhythms. Cerebrum. The cerebrum, we can skip that slide, is the rest of the brain. It's about 2 pounds. It has a right side and a left side. Your brain weighs 3 pounds, so it's most of your brain. Humans have the most developed cerebrum of any animal. We're going to cover the cerebrum pretty fast. Okay? Cerebrum has right and left side, and the important idea here, I think, is that this thick band of axons called the corpus callosum provides communication between the right and left sides. Okay? So you have the right brain, the left brain, and then a band of nerves that go across to make that communication happen. When we call it the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain we can see, and we'll come back to this. Okay, so here's another drawing showing the 2 hemispheres of the brain. Okay, this part on the outside is called the cerebral cortex, and then the fibers in between called the corpus callosum. So yeah, this is where we do all of our stuff. We humans use the cerebral cortex to do what we are. This is where we are who we are. Okay, each side of the correct cerebral cortex is 4 lobes. You don't necessarily need to know this. Okay, and it says cerebral cortex controls voluntary movements and cognitive functions, all the thinking stuff you have to do. Here's a look at a map of the cerebral cortex. Okay, and we know this from brain damaged people or from when people have had surgery and we've done some tests on them. Okay, you can't obviously do it on a dead brain. So vision areas back here. Somatosensory association means, okay, what do you feel? How do you know what you feel? Auditory association, how can you understand the words I'm saying, is down here. Smell over here. The ability to speak right here. Okay, and then across the middle, the motor cortex, we'll look at that in some detail, and the feeling cortex. And then up here, a really special place, this is where you are, who you are, resides. What makes you distractible? What makes you funny? What makes you grumpy? Well, I shouldn't say grumpy. Who you are, what you are, is right there. So this is a bunch of yada yada about this slide. I'm going to skip it. What we see here is a map cut through the middle of the brain, and we look at the edges here. For example, if we look at the edge of the motor cortex, in different spots along here is where nerves controlling these things are. So all the nerves controlling the face are right in here, pretty closely associated with the nerves that control the hand and fingers and thumb. Okay, in the sensory area, same idea. Nerves that feel things from the tongue, for example, are located right down in here. Now remember, though, we have a right and a left side. So the right side of our brain, this is just showing one half of the brain. It looks identical in the other half of the brain. So we know that if you feel something in your left thumb, you're feeling it. This is your left brain. Your right thumb, you're feeling it right about there in your brain. Okay? And so what we know is that our brain is lateralized. And if you've had art class with Mrs. St. John, you've heard about this. The left side is more adept at language, math, logic, and processing. The right hemisphere is stronger at pattern recognition, nonverbal thinking, and emotional processing. One thing the right side can do is recognize faces. Pattern recognition. So, We've mapped areas for language and speech. I already showed you that. They've named them like Broca's area and Wernicke's area. We can look at this a little later. They've mapped it by doing functional MRI images. Feed somebody some radioactive glucose and then have them do a skill and watch on the brain scan where they're mostly using their nerve cells, okay? Because if you feed them radioactive glucose, they're going to do cell respiration faster where they're using their nerve cells. And so this is how we can map the brain nowadays. Used to be we had to use brain injured people. Still do, actually. Emotions. I mentioned the hypothalamus, but where we really find emotions is what's called the limbic system. And here's a spot where we really have trouble because now we're getting into stuff that's really hard to measure. Okay? And we know that it's like this loose connection of things. Buried deep in the brain is a place called the amygdala. You also have the hippocampus. These are in charge of memory and emotions. These all kind of tie together along with the hypothalamus and the thalamus. Now here's an interesting thing though. Olfactory bulb is the center of smell. Notice that there's a direct connection between smell and emotion and memory, which is really interesting. So I can remember the girl in front of me in high school that had the perfume on I couldn't stand. The perfume was called Forever Crystal. And if I smell that perfume today, believe it or not, it still exists from the 1980s, I remember that instantly. Instantly. And you all have smells that bring back memories and emotions just instantly. Some hotels I walk into, they must use the same cleaner as my college dorm room used. So I instantly smell my dorm and remember it when I go into certain hotels. That's because my olfactory bulb is directly tied to my emotion and memory center. And we don't care about that. Skip this slide. So the research nowadays is into central nervous system injuries and disease. And there's a bunch of discussion about that in the textbook. We're just looking, I think our current research today is stem cells, nervous system stem cells, to try to replace or repair damaged nerves. Because remember, nerve cells don't do mitosis. The CNS cannot repair itself because they don't do mitosis. And that's a brief discussion of the central nervous system.